So here we are picking up in 1 Samuel chapter 4. And I was thinking this week as I read this passage about one of the great privileges of being a pastor, which is that somewhat regularly people from the community and from the congregation will seek me out and share with me in their times of decision making or processing a tragedy or moving through crisis or interpreting a challenging situation. I mean, I'm so honored when people share that stuff with me. I'm sure when you have friends or family members who open up to you at those critical junctures of life, you can identify with that privilege. But I've also observed that one of the big reasons that people often want to talk to a pastor at precisely those times is because we are just trying to figure out what God is up to in those times. I mean, what's God's will for this situation? What's my next step? What's happening? Like maybe if you're going through a hard time, sometimes people ask me, is God punishing me? Or why isn't this plan that I thought was so good working out? Or even sometimes, whether we share it with our pastor or not, we can have that thought like, why does life seem to be working out for those people, but not for me, even though I think I'm godlier than they are, right? I mean, there's these questions that run through our minds, and a great deal of pastoral work and just the work of ministry relating to people is helping them discern and recognize the role of the invisible God in our very visible lives. Now, this week in 1 Samuel, we come across an amazing question in the text. It's found in the mouth of some of the Philistine kings, and they are wrestling with the exact same sort of question. Where's the invisible God at work in our visible lives? They say in 1 Samuel 5, verse 8, and they also say at the beginning of 1 Samuel 6, they ask the same question, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? What a great question. Now, in these three chapters that we're going to be moving through pretty quickly this morning, 1 Samuel 4, 5, and 6, we're going to see three different answers to that question that are not particularly effective. But, kind of like in a process of elimination, they do point us forward toward a solid, biblical, healthy answer to the question of what shall we do with God in our midst. Now, just before we pick up with this verse in chapter 4, remember, so far in the book of Samuel, we've seen Hannah miraculously enabled to give birth to a son who is Samuel. And then Dave preached very vigorously last week about Samuel and how Samuel is learning to discern the voice of God amidst all the other voices and noise in his world. And so we have seen in these first three chapters of 1 Samuel that God is raising up Samuel to be someone important. And as we will see, he was actually going to become sort of the kingmaker, the one who anoints Saul and then David, and who gives so much direction as he leads Israel. But even as we've heard that story of the rise of Samuel, we've caught some echoes and some hints that life in Israel is probably not quite as it should be. Eli, the priest at the area of worship in Shiloh, he's got corrupt sons who are stealing the offering of God, and then it says that they're sleeping with the women who serve around the tent of meeting. It's just a decrepit situation. And 1 Samuel 4, 5, and 6 continue that snapshot of the context of Israel, really that chaos out of which God will bring the kingdom. And that context, that chaos is so important because God works and speaks and raises up David and is just doing stuff in the midst of the real world. I mean, the whole assumption of the Bible is that God, as creator, has something to say into his creation. But we need to catch what's happening among his people and in his creation in order to fully grasp what he's saying to them moving forward. So 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 1 says, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now, Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the people came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. This story begins with a crisis. Israel is defeated before the Philistines. It says 4,000 men died on the field of battle. Now it's interesting, some of the numbers in Samuel are subject to some question or dispute, like how many people were really there. In the original language, that word 1,000 can also be translated as a military unit, so it could be something more like 4 squads were killed. It could also be translated potentially as specially picked warriors. So we don't know exactly whether it was 4,000 specific people. It's just one of those words that has some flexibility to it. It was 4,000 people or 4 units for those specially picked. We don't know exactly, but we do know that there was a significant defeat. And it was significant enough that all the leaders of Israel got together and said, "What should we do?" And they come up with this answer: let's get the ark. Let's bring the ark of the covenant in. Now, some of you know your Old Testament really well. Others of you guys are just learning it. What is the Ark of the Covenant? And it is this tangible symbol of God's relationship with his people. Remember, this people Israel, they used to be slaves in Egypt. God delivered them after the 10 plagues. They came to the foot of Mount Sinai, and there God descended on the mountaintop, and he spoke out of the midst of the fire. And it's this massive transcendent moment where Moses gets the 10 commandments and the rest of the law. And there's sort of this question: how could that God, who's set a whole mountain on fire, dwell with these people? And part of the answer comes in the instructions regarding the construction of the tabernacle, this tent of meeting. And at the very heart of the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant. And God gives Moses very specific instructions about building this ark. You got them there on your sheet. Exodus 25, God says, "You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony," or the commandments, "that I will give you. And there I will meet with you. And from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel." This Ark of the Covenant is a meeting place between God and his people. In fact, I think we've got a picture of what some artists think the ark roughly looked like. And remember, this is not a huge piece of furniture. It's about 4 feet by 2 feet, the size of a TV box or something like that, maybe a little bit more square. Not a flat screen, kind of an old school TV. It was a little deeper in the back. And in the ark, we learn, as we read through that Old Testament story, God had them place 3 things. Of course, we see the commandments mentioned in the passage we just read. And this is a reminder that when we meet with God, he has a will for our lives, right? There are commands. He sees what's best. But then also, God commanded them when they were eating manna in the wilderness to take kind of a jar of manna and keep it in the ark as a reminder that this relationship between God and his people would be a relationship of provision. That everything we have as God's people depends on his good hand. And then finally, there's the staff of Aaron, the rod of Aaron, this reminder that God is our deliverer and our leader through times of trial. So these elements in the ark remind us of the nature of the relationship God wants with his people. The other thing that's very interesting is when you think about that picture of the ark, the thing that's missing is any representation of God himself. The ark is not an idol. It's not a physical, carved, wooden or stone representation of God. Rather, it's that mercy seat that we just sang about, God's mercy, where we meet with God. And that's very important because it reminds us that the absence of any representation or graven image of God, it reminds us that he's not an idol that we carve with our own hands. He's not going to be appeased or controlled by human manipulations. Rather, he is a God who wants to meet with his people. And so what do the Israelites do with it? Well, they lose a big victory, big battle. They're defeated in battle, and then they come up with this plan. Let's take that Ark of the Covenant into battle with us. Picking up in verse 5. As soon as the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A god has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. And they fled, every man to his home, and there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Now this marks the end of an era in the history of Israel. Remember, we mentioned these sons of Eli were corrupt and in many ways represented the corruption of the whole religious system surrounding Israel. And a man of Benjamin runs back from the battle to Shiloh, where Eli sits, waiting, heartsick, wondering, will the ark return from battle? And when this messenger tells Eli that the ark has been lost, Eli keels over dead at 98 years old. And Phinehas' widow, his wife, she was pregnant actually when he was at the battlefront. This news throws her into labor. She gives birth to a son, names the child Ichabod, which is literally the glory is gone, and then she dies. So this plan didn't work out very well. What shall we do with the ark of God? Well, not this, let's say. Why? What happened here? What went wrong? You know, there are other examples where the ark of God is involved in military engagements. You think about Jericho. They're carrying the ark as they're walking around the building of Jericho in the book of Joshua. Maybe part of the answer is found in verse 3 that we read. When the leaders of Israel suffer this defeat, they don't consult God. They just talk amongst themselves. Why did God defeat us? I don't know. Let's bring the ark. Okay. And that sort of presumption is in many ways disrespectful to God. If you think about the ark as symbolic of the relationship God has with his people, here the ark is disrespected. They treat it more superstitiously, more magically, sort of God in a box idea that could just be lugged to whatever conflict needed resolving. They think that maybe if they just bring the ark, it'll sort of manipulate or make God remember his covenant and help them win this battle. And it's interesting because the Philistines, they were a formidable opponent, and we will hear more about them as we read Samuel. They had a sort of advancement in their military. They had the mastery of iron working, and so their weapons were way better than pretty much anybody else in the Bronze Age. And then also when they excavate these Philistine cities that are still, like their ruins are still around in the Near East, well, they find a huge number of beer flagons and I mean cups, I guess you'd call them, but suppose, you know, a few thousand years ago they probably call them flagons. But the idea is that the Philistines are these fierce fighters and hard drinkers, kind of marauding and brawling against Israel. But if you notice what happens when Israel brings the Ark of the Covenant into the camp, Israel all like, yay, we're gonna win. It's the Philistines, these fierce fighting, hard drinking warriors who actually show more reverence or fear of the Ark than Israel does. And that's a pretty big indictment of where Israel is in her relationship as a nation with God. They simply assume that by bringing the Ark, God will fight the battle for them. And I don't know about you, but for me, I can't really think of anything that kind of winds me up, or maybe I would perceive, nothing I would perceive is more disrespectful than somebody going and doing something and says, oh yeah, Stalls told me to do that, but it totally doesn't represent my heart. Can you think of that? Can you think of a time in your life when you've had somebody who goes out and does something sort of in your name, but you did not want them to do that? That's really frustrating. And we shouldn't be surprised that God didn't just snap his fingers and defeat all the Philistines in this battle. And it raises this interesting question. Do we ever presume upon God to fight battles in our lives that God may not be interested in fighting? I mean, maybe a rather obvious historical example could be the Crusades. Now, the Crusades encompass 400 years of fighting in the medieval times. There's all sorts of complexities and different narratives and all sorts of different stories. But one of the things that consistently happened in the Crusades was a lot of brutal slaughter as Christians mobilized from all across Europe and all across the West to go back and battle and sort of reclaim Israel and the Holy Land from Muslim invaders. And you remember how the Crusaders went into battle. They painted crosses on their shields. What an irony that the supreme display of God's self-giving love was literally wielded as a weapon of violence. Sort of seems parallel in some ways to this story of the ark when they just march it into the middle of this battle. But it's not just in history. I mean, even in the public sphere, right? We hear often people, sometimes politicians, invoking God's name and God's will to support this policy or this perspective or viewpoint or this military invasion. And this is not to say that God has no will for any of those issues. I believe he does. He does have an opinion about how we live. He does have an opinion about political stuff. I think God really cares about the lives of unborn babies. I believe God has given humanity a stewardship to care well for the world that we live in. But we need to be reverent, cautious, listening before we just paint a cross on our shields or carry the Ark of the Covenant into a battle or slap this God-ordained label on something. But then on a personal level, we do it too, don't we? Sometimes when we're dealing with a defeat or something deeply troubles us, or we're going, what just happened? Sometimes we think, oh, well, if we can just get a little bit more religious, I just got to get back in church or dial up that commitment, then we're going to fix it. What do we need? We should probably just, instead of doing that, we should just stop and say, God, what happened there? God, are you wanting to tell me something? Like, is this defeat? Is this thing that's troubling me? Is this big question? This dead end? Is this you? Kind of like Eli said to Samuel, hey, maybe that's God speaking. That's the step that the people of Israel missed. They simply didn't ask God. They presumed, if we bring the ark in, then we will win. But as we'll see, Israel's defeat here is not because God was absent, not because he was powerless. It's because God refused to be co-opted by religion without real relationship with himself. And now the Philistines have the ark. 1 Samuel 5, verse 1. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. And then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. The hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. I can just imagine those priests walking in the next morning and seeing their idol face down on the ground and saying, "Daggone." Sure, yeah, God is mighty. And so here's the thing. The Philistines think that in capturing the ark, they've just gotten the weapon that had provided the plagues against the Egyptians. It was like they kind of got the A-bomb, or suddenly they're a nuclear power or something. And they bring it back and they just put it in among their other idols. Now, in the Canaanite Philistine world, Dagon was considered the sort of father of Baal. He's a god of the harvest. And in many ways, right, the worship of Dagon would have been this worship of prosperity and harvest and grain and wealth. And the picture here is so powerful because you can't just take Yahweh and make him an addition or a trophy in your temple, in your place of worship. I mean, they learn what happens in that strategy. And if you pay attention to the text, Dagon is huge. I mean, he's big enough that when he falls face down, it seems that his idol falls across the threshold. So Dagon, this idol, is taller than the room is wide. And yet, he's brought low by this little box. He's left headless and handless, incapable of speaking, incapable of acting. Verse 6, the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? That's the question, isn't it? They answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. So they brought the ark of the God of Israel there. And that begins this tour for the ark through the Philistine cities. I think I have a map, actually, that helps us figure out what's going on here. Up in the upper right-hand corner is Shiloh. That's where the ark originally was. They got it from Shiloh, the Israelites did, took it over to the top in the center, Aphek. That's where the battle happened, and they lost. And then the Philistines took it from Aphek back down to Ashdod. That's where the whole Dagon thing happened. And then in Ashdod, they start talking about what should we do? And they send it on this tour around their cities. But everywhere the ark goes, plagues and tumors break out. And for 7 months, the ark is there, wreaking havoc among the Philistines. And so finally, at the beginning of chapter 6, they ask again, what shall we do with the ark of the Lord? And they come up with a strategy. They're going to send it away. So they load up a brand new cart. They get 2 milk cows with young calves, and they put the ark on this cart, and they send it off in the direction of Israel. And they're trying to figure out whether or not this is a supernatural occurrence in their midst. And so their selection of milk cows who currently have calves would be an indication of this. So they keep the calves behind the milk cows. And if the milk cows were just working in their own natural volition, they won't leave behind their calves. But what happens in the story is that as soon as they set those milk cows free, they head straight away from their calves back to Israel. It's almost like God supernaturally is affirming to the Philistines, yes, this is me. I have been wreaking havoc in your midst. And what we see here with the Philistines is that the ark is rejected. See, with the Israelites, the ark is disrespected. With the Philistines, the ark is rejected. Why is it rejected? Well, if you notice, they tried to put the ark in among their current idol. And God doesn't really work with that very well. It reminds me of the scene in Mark chapter 10 in the New Testament where there's a rich young leader And he comes up to Jesus and he says, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, you know the commandments, and he begins to list some of those 10 commandments. And the rich young ruler is pretty positive. He says, you know what, I've done all that. And Jesus says, okay, then just one more thing remains. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And then the rich young ruler, it says in the text, was saddened because he had much wealth. And he went away. And what happened? This rich young ruler clearly had a deep allegiance to his wealth. It gave him an identity. It gave him a level of comfort, maybe even some power in his life. It was holding that place of primary allegiance. And now he comes to Jesus and says, I want to follow God. I want to be a part of eternal life. And Jesus says, in order for that to happen, it's pretty simple, but it's going to require dislodging the idol that sits in the primary place of your heart's affection. And the rich young ruler says, nope, that cost is too great. Seems so much to me like what happened with the Philistines. I mean, the first day they come back and Dagon's face down on the temple floor, and it says they have to pick him up with their own hands. Like they continue in the folly of saying, okay, sorry, Dagon, let us pick you up. Like you're still pretty powerful. We want you to still be there. The second day he comes back, he's handless and headless before the ark of God. But the Philistines never considered like, maybe we should just hop on this Yahweh train. They stick with Dagon, just like this rich young ruler holds fast to his wealth. Jesus puts it this way in the Sermon on the Mount: no man can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And then Jesus says, you cannot serve God and money. And this text is reminding us that in God's economy, we only can have one primary, ultimate allegiance. Make no mistake. If in our relationship with God, we just want to dabble while changing nothing about our allegiance to wealth or reputation or power or Dagon or whatever that idol might be, if we want to just dabble without dealing with the ultimate allegiance issues of our heart, there will come a day when we wake up to realize that those idols are face down and powerless before the mighty hand of the living God. And if we do not recognize that, if we continue in the folly of setting those idols up with our own effort, we will eventually find ourselves sending God off, rejecting him, watching him disappear over the horizon. This is a stern warning. Where we left off in chapter 6, the ark is going off into the distance. The Philistine rulers are watching it go. And now the story picks up in 6, verse 13, with the Israelite perspective. There's some people in this area, this village of Beth Shemesh, and they're reaping their wheat harvest in the valley. And when they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark, they rejoiced to see it. Verse 14, the cart came into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh and stopped there, and a great stone was there, and they split up the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the box that was beside it, in which were the golden figures, and set them upon the great stone. And the men of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrifices on that day to the Lord. And when the 5 lords of the Philistines saw it, they returned that day to Ekron. So far, so good. There are yet faithful among the people of Israel. When they see the ark, they know it's been lost, it's come back, they're excited, they sacrifice. The Levites, who are the right people to handle the ark, come around, and there's this sort of celebration. They receive the return of the Lord with gladness. But then we get to 1 Samuel 6, verse 19, and he struck some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. He struck 70 men of them, and the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people with a great blow. And then the men of Beth Shemesh said, who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? And to whom shall he go up away from us? So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim, saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to you." And the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. And they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. And from the day that the ark was lodged at Kiriath Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. This is the third strategy with the ark. And it begins, as you notice, with a rush of gladness, the sacrifice, the excitement. The ark is back. And then something unexplainable really happens. We don't know. The text doesn't give us much detail. Various old versions say maybe that they tried to look inside the ark, these 70 men. Maybe they approached it in a dishonoring way. We really don't know exactly what happened, but the holiness of God broke out against the wickedness of mankind, and these 70 people are dead. And the people there in Beth Shemesh don't know what to do with it. There's this tragic event, and it's so jarring, so disconcerting, so disruptive to their understanding of who God is. And once again, rather than pressing into the relationship with God to understand, if you notice, they just sort of put it up in the corner and let it sit in obscurity for 20 years. Here now, the ark is neglected. Does this ever happen to you? You have these moments where it seems like God comes into your life and you're on fire and you recognize his grace and his goodness and you're all in for God, and then something happens and you don't know quite how to sort it out, but it's tragic and it's unsettling and you're not quite sure what to do with God about that, and so just rather than deal with it, you send it up to Kiriath Jearim for 20 years. See, the ark, the central point of worship in the life of Israel, doesn't make another appearance until 2 Samuel chapter 6, where David goes, "Hey, where's the ark again? Oh yeah, we should bring that back to Jerusalem." 20 years later. I think this happens in our walk with God all the time. Exciting moments, unexplainable, difficult tragedies, and our temptation is to do what these people did here in Beth Shemesh, just put God on the shelf, neglect him. What do these three strategies teach us about God? What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Well, here's one thing we see about God that comes through crystal clear in all three episodes. God is entirely free. He is a free God. And neither the religious tradition of the Israelites nor the military might of the Philistines could control him. In this story, God does not brook insult or divided hearts or flippant disregard. God's totally free. We respond to him, he responds to us, but we do not by any stretch of the imagination control or manipulate him. And sometimes we can lose sight of that. Maybe you've heard that phrase around church, God has no hands but our hands. That's a great phrase to recruit volunteers, like, hey, God has no hands but our hands, and we need some of those hands down in the nursery with some diaper drive stuff. And to a certain extent, that's true. God does work through his people. But did you see what happened in the story with the Philistines? It says God's hand was heavy against the Philistines. He didn't need the Israelite human hands to work out his will. He didn't need anybody to come carry his ark around. God is totally free. And this is actually really, really, really good news. Because as we see this story, look what people do when they think they have God in a box. I mean, they take him into wars that don't reflect his heart. They think they can stack him on the shelf alongside the other idols of our hearts. They leave him neglected for 20 years. So this is good news, that God is totally free from our human short-sightedness and silliness. But what should we do with the ark of God? You know, the ark, of course, in the Old Testament is a picture of Jesus in the New. It's made of wood covered with gold. Even that echoes Jesus' human and divine nature unified in one place. Just as the ark in the Old Testament was the meeting place between Israel and God, so through Jesus in the New Testament, we know we can have a relationship with God. Jesus is our meeting place with God. And so as the story of the Bible unfolds, we see that ark of the Old Covenant is fulfilled and transcended in the Son of God, the Christ of the New Covenant. And so that question we've been asking and echoing with the Philistine leaders, what shall we do with the ark of God? It echoes forward today, now to us. What shall we do with the Son of God? Matthew 16 has one of those high moments of the New Testament, telling the story. Jesus asked his own followers the same kind of question. First, he says, who do people say that I am? They come up with a few different responses, the prophet, Elijah. But then Jesus drives home the point. Who do you say that I am? And remember, Peter gets it right. He says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, only my Father who's in heaven. And then he tells Peter, I'm going to build my church on this rock. And the very next scene, just a couple verses later, Jesus begins sharing about his death and his resurrection. And Peter runs up to Jesus and says, no, that is not a good plan. And remember what Jesus says to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. What a turnaround. Here's Peter going from getting the right answer to totally opposing the plans of God in just a few verses. You ever feel that way in your life? And here, Jesus says, Peter, you're not thinking about God's things, you're thinking about man's things. And this is why it's such good news that God is so free. That he's free of us, that he's committed to us, he loves us, he wants relationship with us, he provides for us, he leads us, he delivers us. He has a will for our lives, he speaks into our world, but he is not beholden to us. When we remember that story about Peter, when we remember that story about Jesus, who do you say that I am? It's Jesus saying to Peter, what will you do with the Son of God? And Peter gets it sort of right. But you know what? Peter never would have come up with the crucifixion and the resurrection as a plan. In fact, when Jesus rolls that plan out to the disciples, Peter's like, that's not a good plan. Fortunately, God is fully free. And God, in his freedom, knows that way of the cross and the resurrection is really the only way to see sin vanquished and Satan defeated so that we might live eternally with him. So we should be grateful that God is free. He's not limited to our ideas about how he should accomplish what we think he should accomplish. But at the same time, it can be deeply unsettling to fully embrace the freedom of God. Because we can't control him. We can't manipulate him. We can't water him down. We have to come to grips with that. Sometimes that's too much for some of us to embrace. Sometimes we've had experiences in life that have taught us that we have to hold on. We've got to control the situation or else we're going to get hurt. We can't trust those people because people aren't trustworthy. All these things around us, they can lead us to this place where we feel like we've got to be in charge of everything. And then we come up close to this totally free God who is good, but he's free, and he's kind, but we can't control him. And it is unnerving. And we're tempted, like the Israelites, to disrespect him. We're tempted, like the Philistines, to eventually reject him because he doesn't fit into our current scheme of worship. Or we're tempted, like the people of Beth Shemesh, to just neglect him. Here's what the scripture is calling us to, deeply and profoundly. God desires to be respected. When we experience defeat, let's go to him. God, what happened? God desires to be accepted without rival. That when he is working in our lives, we become open to letting him knock down whatever daggone thing we've got. And God desires to be cherished, not neglected. And we come across stuff in life that we don't fully understand now. We even see tragedies, and we can't put all the pieces together. And yet he says, can you trust me? Can you even praise me in that place?